Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Another party was having its own internal bleeding. Labour's deputy leader, Tom Watson, recognising that the government may soon be that of a hard Brexiteer, had called on his party to sign up with clarity and conviction to a second referendum on Brexit. We thought today would be the day we heard that confirmed by the leader, but it wasn't, not quite. It was a further statement from Jeremy Corbyn that tried to please everyone and was understood by no one. Perhaps that was the point. Nick Watt is back with me. You know what happened in that meeting, Nick?
Yes, I mean, as you say, a movement of sorts. Jeremy Corbyn saying there should be a public vote on any deal. The pro-Europeans say not good enough. We need to hear you really supporting a second referendum and saying that you would campaign for Remain in that referendum. I spoke to one senior member of the Shadow Cabinet who was at that meeting today, talked about how it was all about more fudge from Jeremy Corbyn and how the meeting had been hilariously indecisive. There was then some amusement and a bit of a sort of a weary sigh when Jeremy Corbyn said that he'd been reading the biography of Harold Wilson, the Labour Prime Minister in the 60s and the 70s. Now, Harold Wilson famously renegotiated Britain's EEC membership terms. He then recommended Remain, had a referendum, gave a free vote to members of his cabinet, and then basically sat back. And the feeling is, Jeremy Corbyn, is he going to sit back? But the most significant intervention at that Shadow Cabinet meeting, I understand, was John McDonnell, Shadow Chancellor, his key ally. He evidently turned to Jeremy Corbyn and says there's a danger that we are looking inauthentic with our triangulation on Brexit, and maybe he, Jeremy Corbyn, would like to think of backing Remain and Reform.
Interesting. Nick, thanks very much indeed. Well, we're joined now by the second referendum supporting MP Stephen Doughty and two Labour experts trying to see if they can change his mind or understand the political workings of the party. Stephen Bush, political editor of The New Statesman, and Ash Sarkar, the senior editor at Novara Media. Nice to have you all. I want to talk actually about that authenticity, because that has been, hasn't it, the Labour brand all the way through. Do you hear the authentic voice of Labour at the moment, Stephen?
Well, I think the authentic voice of Labour is an internationalist voice, and it's one that stands up against austerity, and it talks about investing in our public services. And for me, the Brexit options that are on the table are not going to end austerity. They're not going to be able to deliver for our public services. They're not going to be able to deliver more money for special educational needs like we've just seen in the package before. And I was meeting teachers today who were telling me about cuts in their schools, and I'm meeting police officers who are talking about cuts to their police services. All of the Brexits that are on offer are going to result in less money for those public services.
So did you think today was going to yield a new answer? Did you expect a different statement from the leader today?
Well, I think I was hoping for a very clear and unequivocal statement. There was definitely some movement, and that's always welcome. But I met Jeremy with other Labour MPs from both Leave and Remain voting constituencies earlier in this week, and we made very clear time is running out. We're facing a hard-right Conservative Prime Minister coming in who is going to take us to an even worse situation than even Theresa May was offering. Labour needs to be clear, categorical, and do it now before the die is set.
I'm going to come to you in a second, Ash, but Stephen Bush, you don't think time is running out, do you? I mean, do you think this is optimal fudge time?
Well, so, yeah, I think the interesting is the thing that this presentation the Shadow Cabinet had said, which I think is absolutely true, is that their position of being all things to all people worked really well for them until about March, when suddenly it stopped working. And at the moment, it's very obvious it's not. However, what's also clear is they're going to lose votes to Remain. At the moment, they're losing votes mainly to Remainers, but also a little bit to Leavers. Whatever option they pick, they're either going to aggravate one of those problems. The Conservative Party is almost certainly going to pick someone who is, I was about to say the patron saint, but actually quite the reverse. Yeah, someone who is the villain pin-up for most Remain voters is going to become the Conservative leader. If I were in the Labour Party, I'd be thinking, maybe if we wait a couple more weeks, maybe constructive ambiguity will come back into vogue. Let's wait and see if we have to pin our colours to the mast. And if we do, we do. If we don't, we don't. I think that they'd be very unwise to pick now when it's too late to save those 10 MEPs they lost, too late to save those 80 councillors that they lost, and we don't yet know what the shape of the Liberal Democrats or the shape of the Conservative Party is going to be.
Because, Ash, this is bluntly about naked electioneering, isn't it? I mean, perish the thought. But you know what I mean? It's not actually about authenticity. It's just about working out how you keep or gain seats.
I actually think authenticity plays a really important role in that. So what we've seen from Jeremy Corbyn is that it's his ability to mobilise the membership, get them out, get them campaigning, get them door knocking, which has made all the difference in key swing constituencies. It's why they were able to hold on to Peterborough. And I think that the longer this compromise, which no one really wants, goes on and they keep trying to hold this line, the more demobilised that membership is going to become. And when it comes to doing things like making sure that exciting policy cuts through, whether it's declaring a climate emergency or a green industrial revolution or reviving the Ministry of Labour, without that membership engaged and enthusiastic, that policy is not going to cut through when there's a hostile media as well. So I think when it comes to electioneering tactics, it's not just about winning seats, it's about making sure that the message
You're
gets
talking about a
across.
hostile media. It's a media that is trying desperately to understand what the Labour Party on this position is, and its own MPs can't explain to us any more than we can explain to them.
And I think that's the other thing, is in the face of an arch fraff machine like Boris Johnson, who pretty much says anything as long as it gets him one step closer to power, you need a point which is made with clarity and consistency coming from Jeremy Corbyn himself. In the last few months, he's become a very distant and remote figure from the membership, from the movement, from the public, and that's something which is going to need to change.
Jeremy Corbyn doesn't entirely seem to be running the party anymore, does he?
Well, look, I don't think you can triangulate with the hard right. I don't think you can triangulate with the populist right, which is, of course, what Farage and the Brexit Party represent, because not only is it not right in terms of where Labour values sit, but again, you know, it doesn't sort of please people anymore. They want Labour to be setting out a clear, radical vision. You know, people liked our manifesto in 2017. They felt motivated. My members are telling me that they're demoralised at the moment. They're not keen to go out on the doorstep because they don't feel they can sell something clear on the doorstep, but also on the issue of the day. You know, the biggest decision facing us in 50, 60 years.
But you've
they don't
got
have
a
that
very
clear and equivocal
Remain-facing
position.
seat in Cardiff.
No, I have strong Leave voting areas. Indeed, I had a very strong UKIP vote in 2015. But I went out there and I had frank discussions with friends, neighbours, relatives, other people who had voted Leave, and I understand why they did so. But actually, the vast majority of them wanted to talk about pensions. They wanted to talk about the NHS. They wanted to talk about the dementia tax. They wanted to talk about all those other things in that 2017 election.
Don't you see that, Stephen, that they are hemorrhaging more people than they would if they just stopped now?
Are they? I mean, I think, yeah, the thing
4
that,
to 1,
but the thing that no one wants to talk about, understandably...
Just explain, because your article talked about this 2-1-1 breakdown, which is 2 voters are going to the Lib Dems, 1 voter goes to the Greens, and 1 voter goes to Brexit.
Yeah.
So presumably it's a 3-to-1 Remain Leave in that positioning,
Yeah,
right?
at the moment, for every vote they lose to the Brexit Party, they lose 3 to a party of Remain. Now, obviously, the nightmare scenario is that continues, and that would, of course, mean that the Labour Party does not only lose the next election, but is in an existential position. However, you know, Labour's ace in the hole has always been our iniquitous electoral system, which allows them to point to the other smaller parties of the left and centre and go, look, you might not be happy with us, but we're the only party that can beat the Tories. Now, if Rory Stewart looked like he was going to become Conservative leader, someone who can appeal to that type of Labour voter...
Then the middle ground is back with him.
Then maybe they're at risk. But actually, I think that they've probably got an opportunity to say, look, you might not like our Brexit position, but it's us or Boris Johnson.
And I actually think that's so toxic for the project, because I think that the things that attracted me to Corbynism, this is someone who had real scepticism towards the Labour Party for most of my life, was optimism, the ability to shift the dominant frame in which something was being articulated, and integrity. And I think the minute you start saying, look, we're the worst of 2 evils, so you may as well give us your vote.
It's not a position of integrity. It doesn't say, I'm Jeremy Corbyn and I want to stay in the EU.
It also doesn't account for the fact that in Wales we're facing a significant challenge from Plaid Cymru. In Scotland, the SNP, you know, running roughshod. Labour's dropped down to 5th or 6th place. That's an extraordinary situation.
The fundamental mistake was in the 2017 election. They allowed that line to be rolled out that 80% of the electorate had voted, or the voting electorate had voted for Brexit-facing parties. And Labour must have known then that a lot of people that voted for it in 2017 were not fans of Brexit. I mean, why did they carry that for so long?
I think there's also a deeper problem, which is we're still trying to make sense of who was it that delivered the 2016 referendum result and who also delivered the 2017 electoral coalition, which saw Jeremy Corbyn rob Theresa May of her majority. And I think one of the the difficulties in the Labour Party and the thing that they're wrestling with is who is a Labour voter now? Is it in the formerly industrialised heartland, or is it in the
Your
south,
colleagues who would
the
probably
southeast?
like to keep their seats in the north.
And thinking about the way in which London's displaced voters are changing Essex and
Kent. I think we need to be very careful talking about the north as some sort of homogenous whole. Look at Labour voters in the northwest. Look at them in the northeast. You know, significant numbers of people there now arguing that we need to put this back to people. They want to have their say, and they're not happy with the prospect of a Boris Johnson government coming in or whoever else leads the Tory party, bringing more austerity, more threats to our public services. People want to have a say on this, and presenting the north as all one whole, it's just not true. The South Wales valleys are not one
and
whole.
I think a return to the electorate is something which can hold together that diverse electoral coalition much better, rather than something which upsets everyone a little bit. Because I think at the moment, the minute you start talking in a frame of, well, how can we just decline the slowest, you've turned way more people off than you do when you say, you know what, these are the values we stand for, so we're going to fight for them.
Could they lose you? I mean, why aren't you now a natural Green supporter?
Well, the thing is, the reason why I'm not a natural Green supporter is that they don't have the connection that Jeremy Corbyn's Labour has to working people in this country.
And still has?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing, is that Labour's Leave voters are softer Leave voters than Conservative Leave voters. They've got more room to say, look, the compromise option has shifted towards a second referendum when the country's polarised between revoke or no deal. I think that's a very strong case to make to your Labour Leave voters.
Mark Drakeford, the Welsh Labour leader in Wales, has seen very, very clearly that things have changed. We're now faced by the prospect of a hard-right Conservative leader in hock to the populist right. That means that Labour has to be out there showing leadership, showing decisive leadership, communicating, cutting through, inspiring people, inspiring voters, inspiring our members to go out there and campaign. We can't do that with any more fudge. Time is running out. We've got to take that decisive decision. We've got to put this back to the people. And in my view, we should be campaigning to remain.
OK, thank you all very much. Thanks for coming in.
I'm delighted to see here Labour's Deputy Leader. Now, we're going to talk a bit about referendums and all of that in a minute, but you also gave what I thought was quite an important speech earlier this week, because you are the first senior person in one of the two major parties, I don't know for how long, who actually stood up and said there is a patriotic case for staying in the EU. Now, why do you think that so few senior current politicians are simply unable to make that case?
I think right now politics is focused on the day-to-day. We've been focusing on this failing deal for 3 years. But actually, after those Euro elections, with the Tories in their leadership election, us reflecting on the result, there was a sort of moment for pause, I think. And for me, I just look back at our history. We've been talking a lot about Harold Wilson today. I mean, Harold Wilson said that...
So in the shadow cabinet?
In the shadow cabinet. Harold Wilson once famously said that the qualities of a good Prime Minister are... a good night's sleep and an understanding of history. And so I went back and looked at it and I realised, the case wasn't made in 2016 in that referendum for, the people who created the European Union. They did it because they wanted peace and they wanted economic collaboration. And I just felt I needed to be honest with myself just to get that point over.
I mean, I have to say, I remember that referendum campaign incredibly well, and I was struck at the time that almost nobody made the case for the kind of stability it brought to the whole continent, including Britain. But we are where we are, and you have been passionately for some time in favour of a referendum on whatever form of Brexit is eventually decided upon. There was this important shadow cabinet today. Has Jeremy Corbyn, your leader, signed up now for it to be official policy that there will be a referendum, as far as Labour's concerned, in all circumstances?
Yeah, on any deal, there will be a referendum. Our deliberations continue till next Tuesday. Jeremy felt it was very important that he consulted Trade Union General Secretaries and our National Executive Committee.
And the gap is presumably that you're not clear yet whether Labour will sign up to campaign for Remain in this. Is that the uncertainty?
Yes, how you would campaign. And so next week is going to be quite an historic meeting, I think, because if we do end up deciding we're going to campaign to remain in the EU, it's kind of history making, and I think that's quite important, because we could be electoral history if we don't make a clear statement of intent.
And so just to be clear for you, and obviously Labour, like the Tories, actually has been rather hammered in recent elections and in the polls, for you it's not enough for Labour simply to say you favour a referendum. it's got to be official policy that Labour wants to remain in the EU?
I think for us, I think it's important, you know, go back to the question, what's in the national interest? Where is the worker interest? You know, it seems to me that when Boris Johnson wins, there's no chance of having frictionless borders if he gets his deal through. I mean, that is, to all intents and purposes, the end of British automotive manufacturing, something I've spent my entire life campaigning to defend. Japanese inward investment, the aerospace sector.
I don't normally dodge. Can I just be absolutely clear? I thought your position was Labour has to sign up for
Yes, I'm not dodging. I think under those circumstances, it would be impossible for us not to campaign to remain and make the case for remaining.
But you've got to say it now, though, haven't you?
I think so. I think we're too late to say it. I think I would rather we'd have said it before the European Union elections, but I think we need to be decisive and do it with some humility.
And can I just, because Anushka wants to share just a few important stats with us, but before I go to her, just one final thing. Jeremy Corbyn, as I understood, said to you and your colleagues at Shadow Cabinet today that he'd recently been reading about how Harold Wilson conducted himself in that campaign. It was quite interesting that Wilson, in a sense, stood above the fray. You had Jenkins campaigning for Remain, Ben actually to take us out of what was then the common market. Do you think Corbyn would play a similar role of slightly standing back from the fray?
I think that wouldn't be unreasonable. You know, Harold was a great man, and in difficult circumstances, he held our party together. And I'm looking at Lucy over there. There's no way Jeremy's going to make Lucy do something she doesn't want to do. And so, you know, we've got to be grown up about this.
Yeah.
But I do think the party should have a strong position so we can be clear with the country.
OK, that's very helpful. So this obviously does play into whether or not Labour can win back votes you seem to be losing at the moment. And Anushka, I think you've got some data on this you can share with us.
Yeah, because at that Shadow Cabinet meeting that you've mentioned, there was a leaked document that was circulated that suggested a more pro-Remain position wouldn't necessarily be good for Labour. Now, some of our geeks sort of jumped on that. They don't necessarily agree with that. Take Professor Rob Ford from the University of Manchester. He said you can't just say the seats we need voted Leave, therefore the voters we need in those seats favour Leave. You just can't. And people making this argument base it on data from people like Ian Warren that shows that even in Leave voting constituencies, the Labour vote is often driven by Remain supporters. And overall, Ian Warren has actually published data about the 2017 Labour vote and showed that over 7.5 million of those voters were Remainers, 3.386 were Leavers. That is 69.1% of the total vote. Now, Ian almost doesn't like to be dragged into the debate in Labour. He actually says that his spreadsheets have been weaponised in this debate, and it's not all about data. And I thought it was interesting that today he tweeted this thread from Labour's Lisa Nandy, who said MPs care about more than statistics, and here are a few things that they care about. Number one, the voters that they've lost over recent decades who share their values but think we no longer share theirs. One here, the people who aren't very visible in polls but are angry about a lack of compromise. And number five, keeping our promise. By that she means over Brexit. Yes, really. And that's why she's one of 26 MPs who have signed a letter urging against a second referendum. Robert.
So there is a sort of big question here for Labour. Overwhelmingly, all the data shows that Labour supporters and members want Labour to adopt your position, referendum and remaining. But, you know, in what were traditional Labour areas, there are often described as working-class Labour supporters who are angry about the shift in that direction. Do you just frankly write them off and say Nigel Farage can have them?
You don't write anyone off in politics. I mean, for me, though, it starts with forget where the polls take you. They help inform how you communicate what you think is right. And for me, I think it's right that we make the case for remaining in the EU and that we have a referendum. And what the polls actually show is that's where Labour voters are as well. I mean, it shows that people who voted Leave in 2017, three-quarters of them would now vote to remain in the EU. And they expect Labour to take a position. I think we were right in the early days to reserve judgment, to see how the negotiations went, what the priorities would be. But now they expect us to just give an honest account of ourselves. We can either be Leave or we can be Remain. And I think it is in the national interest we become a pro-Remain, pro-reform party, and that we let the people have a final look at what any deal looks like.
I mean, there is evidence that even in Leave constituencies, on balance, Labour supporters favour Remain, but there are still quite large numbers of former Labour supporters who are desperate for Brexit. And there is a scenario that some of your colleagues are very frightened about, which basically says you've left it too late to persuade some of your core voters to come round to a Remain position. And if Boris Johnson does a deal with Nigel Farage and essentially gives, particularly northern constituencies, gives the Brexit party a free run in some of your constituencies, you might see a hard Brexit Tory Brexit, a hard Brexit alliance between the Boris Johnson Tory party and Nigel Farage winning a majority.
Well, that might be the case. The argument would be that we need to have a completely alternative view of what Britain should look like. If anyone really thinks that Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage are going to stand up for the working people of Britain, then they're in cloud cuckoo land. But that's incumbent on us to have a clear position on Brexit, but also convince people that we want to transform the political economy, because people in the Midlands and the North have been losing out. There are too many losers in the economy. All those young people in the intergenerational divide who are entering the labour market with fewer rights, lower wages. We're not building enough homes for them. How are we going to transform the NHS? Our older folk who need social care. The white noise of Brexit is stopping us getting those messages over, and that's why we need a clear position.
I mean, it's almost impossible for anybody to talk about anything apart from Brexit at the moment, but I do want to bring Lucy in here. Lucy, you have been a Labour MP who has been campaigning for what most people think of as a softer form of Brexit. You haven't been, waving the flag for a referendum. That said, Liberal Democrats surging, taking share from Labour, Greens surging, taking share from Labour. Is Tom right that actually you can't ride both horses and actually you've got to become a Remain referendum supporting party?
Well, I think the sort of riding two horses thing is difficult. I mean, Brexit party surging as well, I would have added to your list. Look, I mean, I think Tom, he's the deputy leader of the Labour Party, and that's a role traditionally which is the voice of the membership. And I think he is advocating what the party membership absolutely want to see.
But you've had your doubts about that. I'm just saying, are you coming round to that position?
Well, I mean, I think it's kind of becoming inevitable, but I think what Anushka was showing us earlier amongst some of that data, we cannot lose sight of that. There are many long-standing Labour voters, they might not have been Labour in 2017, but they were before then, who live in the Midlands and in the North, in my constituency as well, who did vote Leave and who are really angry with us that Brexit isn't happening. And my main worry really about a second referendum is, would the result be any different? Because I've not seen any real evidence that public opinion has shifted, that the recent Euro elections showed us that the country was as divided as ever over Brexit. So a bit like Tom was saying there, I want to see us focusing much more on the deep root causes of Brexit. Why was it that so many traditional Labour areas and other areas voted Leave? Because they're fed up of austerity, they're fed up of not having any opportunity, they're fed up of not having investment, of poor public services, of globalisation and businesses moving out of their town and their area. And we've really got to address that, I think, before we even consider going to another second referendum. Otherwise, we're going to get the same result.
I mean, it does seem to me that Lucy hits on a very important issue here, which is, even if there is a referendum, and whichever way it goes, we are still going to remain, almost certainly, a really divided nation.
Well, but it's a way of getting an end to this, isn't it? I mean, the reason I've...
Would it in reality be?
Well, I think it would. I mean, it would be the third time we've done this. Clearly, parliamentary democracy has let people down. Government have failed. We've had 3 years of paralysis in Westminster. We can't agree on a deal. But as Tony Blair says, it might be we can agree on a process to conclude Brexit. And I think that's the only way you can do that is reluctantly say to the people, here's the deal, take it or leave it.
And what's your message, just to be clear? The 26 of your colleagues who signed this letter, making it clear they're very worried about Labour moving in this direction. Many of them actually on other political issues would be very close to your position.
Yeah.
What do you say to them?
Well, look, I respect their position. You know, the one thing about this debate is there's too much of questioning people's motive. The people who signed that letter strongly believe that. Now, I fundamentally disagree with them, but I don't. You know, I'm not going to criticise them for because they're trying to stand up for their constituents as well. I just disagree fundamentally with them, and I feel very honestly we just have to be straight with the country. There's no way any political party is going to get 100% of its MPs back in any particular option. That has gone. We should just be realistic about that.
I think the idea of unity on almost anything at the moment in any political party is for the birds. Lovely to see you as always.